Hello, welcome to my living room. Today we're going to be talking about combating memory limitations through something I like to call simultaneous triangulation. I know there are a lot of words there, but I promise we'll define each throughout the duration of this talk. First, I wanted to introduce myself. My name's Colette Kolenda, and I lead strategic research for Spotify Free. Before Spotify, I was in academia. I studied neuroscience at Duke University, and I did neuroscience and behavioral science research there. So today, I'm really excited to bring together two of my most nerdy passions: neuroscience and how the brain works, and user research, how we study people and how they interact with technology. Today, the talk will cover three major parts. The first is an introduction to human memory, how it works, and the implications for us as user researchers. The second is a case study of how simultaneous triangulation can combat memory limitations. And the third is a three-step process for how you can implement simultaneous triangulation in your own work. Let's dive in. So as researchers in interviews, we ask participants to recall their experience with a product. In my case, it often takes the form of a question like this: can you tell me about the most recent time that you listened to Spotify? And this is a really useful question because it gives us insights into the experiences and the use cases that people have with our product. But it's important that we think about the reliability and the validity of the data that we collect by asking people to recall their experiences. Are they able to accurately remember that experience? Are they able to reliably describe it, at least in enough detail where we can learn from it? The thing that stands out to me is that the data you get back is really only as reliable as the memory behind it. And that's why I think it's so important for us as researchers to understand how memory works, both the times it works really well and the times when it kind of fails to work well, so that we can design our studies around that and make sure that we're set up to collect good data every single time. With that, let's dive into human memory, how it works, and what this means for us as researchers. So we'll talk a little bit about the memory system. As an overview, it looks like this. We have to pay attention to something in order to bring it into short-term memory. Short-term memory is something like rehearsing a brand new phone number. You might say it over and over again in your head so that you can remember it and type it into your phone accurately. In order to store something, we have to encode it from short-term into long-term memory. And this is about storing that memory trace in cells in our brain called neurons. And lastly, we have to be able to retrieve that memory, or recall it, and then articulate it to someone who's asking. So we'll cover three major steps in the memory system in a little bit more detail, and we'll also talk about the implications for UX research. So first, what we need to know is that attention is required for something to enter into memory. This might seem pretty basic, but honestly, it's really important for us to understand the magnitude of this. We have sensory input going on around us all the time. All of the things we touch, taste, feel, hear, see, all of these things are going on, and so much of it is bombarding our senses at any given point in the day. Right now, you might feel the couch against your back and the laptop on your lap. Maybe you're typing away, taking notes. Hopefully you're listening to this talk as well, so you can hear that, but maybe your dog is also running around, barking and trying to get your attention. Maybe your kids are calling your name, or even, the sounds of car horns or street noise going on in the background. All of this sensory input is hitting our senses, but it's really only the attended information, or the information that we pay most attention to, that actually enters into short-term memory. So if we think about what attention might look like from a computer lens, what this means is that the computer screen is in full focus. You can see everything on the screen in perfect clarity. You can see the number of tracks, each track, the artists, even how long each track is. And all of this information is perfectly clear. Every bit of it is being paid attention to. Human attention, and therefore human memory, might look a little bit different though. Let's imagine a time when you're cooking with your kids in the kitchen. You put Spotify on and you have a dance party with them for the first two songs. That means you're singing along, belting out the lyrics with them for the first two songs. You're really on pace with the beat, the lyrics, every piece of that song. You know it inside and out. But as the rest of the playlist continues, you get lost in cooking. You start gathering the ingredients that you need, getting out the pots and pans, maybe even just making sure your kids aren't too close to the stove or wielding any sharp items. As all this other stuff starts going on, you maybe aren't paying as much attention to Spotify. And therefore, your attention, and thus your memory, might look a little bit like this, where the first 2 songs are crystal clear, but the rest is a little bit more fuzzy. So we need to think about the fact that attention is required to create a memory, but products do not often have full attention, at least not for every single piece of the experience. And it's important that we realize which pieces have full attention, therefore are more likely to be in memory, versus which pieces might be a little bit more blurry or glossed over. The second piece of the memory system is about storage. And here what we need to know is that memory is imperfect, unlike computers. So if we think about computer memory, we can think about taking a picture on a digital camera. When you take that picture, it's captured perfectly. Every pixel is perfectly stored on that SD card, something that looks like this. And on that SD card, if we pop it into our computer, we'll then be able to pull up that same picture and all of its pixels perfectly captured. That could even be days, months, weeks, or even years later. All of that detail will come back in perfect resolution. But if we think about human memory, it doesn't exactly work that way. Human memory is much more dynamic because it's stored in a network of cells in our brains called neurons. And these cells and the connections between these cells, called synapses, can change or evolve over time. As we learn new things or gain new experiences, we can actually change the connections between these cells in our brains. So that's pretty amazing because we're actually able to learn and grow as a result. But that also means that our experience and our ability to remember these experiences might also adapt as we gain new experiences or learn new things. Our memories are much more dynamic compared to computer memories because they're stored in a series of cells, and those cells are alive and changing as our experiences change as well. So in human memory, not all memories are created equal. There are some memories we're more readily able to recall than others. And one example of this is that people are more likely to remember things that are emotionally charged. Let's take a look at what this might mean from an example from my work at Spotify. One of my teammates was running a study to understand how easy or difficult it is to find the right playlist. And what was interesting was one participant that we brought in, her name was Nancy. Nancy talked about how it was actually somewhat difficult for her to find the right playlist. She told us about this time when she tried to find the right music to play in front of her nursing colleagues. She really wanted to show them a new playlist that she had created. But instead, she accidentally clicked on and began to play her Guilty Pleasures playlist. Nancy was horrified. This was super embarrassing for her to play in front of her colleagues, and she immediately rushed to turn it off. She even flushed telling us about this in the interview. But what's important to note is that Nancy probably found playlists successfully almost every day. But the one that she recalled and the one that she described to us was this really embarrassing moment of finding her Guilty Pleasures playlist and accidentally playing that as opposed to the playlist she was actually trying to look for. And this was extremely embarrassing for her because it was in front of all of her nursing colleagues. So Nancy's perception of this experience really matters, right? It's important for us to know when we get it wrong, but it's also important for us to know the other times that we get it right and how accurate or inaccurate those descriptions are. So when asked to recall the experience, people are more likely to report on the salient aspects of the experience, and that may or may not be fully representative of their entire experience. The last piece of the memory system is about retrieval. So this is about actively recalling a memory and being able to describe it to someone else. What we need to know here is that there are retrieval barriers that can prevent or even bias recall. I'm sure we've all had this experience where you're trying to find the precise word for something and it's on the tip of your tongue, but you just can't say it in that moment. You just can't get it out. And what's important to note here is that it's not because you don't know the word. I'm sure you've learned it and probably even used it successfully in a lot of other conversations. It's just in that moment, you can't retrieve it and you can't say it to that other person. Another piece about retrieval is that we have a body of scientific literature that talks a lot about how people may have little ability to report accurately about their cognitive processes. So if we unpack this a little bit, what that means is that people might have difficulty explaining their thought processes, decision-making, or even self-reported behaviors accurately. This is because those things sometimes happen automatically or instinctually, and it's hard for us to describe what exactly happened. So let me talk a little bit about a retrieval issue that comes up in my work at Spotify quite often. In pretty much every session, we start by asking people to describe their experience with Spotify. we ask them to list the services and devices that they use to listen to music and podcasts, and what that looks like on a day-to-day basis. What I found really funny was that over the years I've realized that oftentimes people forget a device or two. Oftentimes it's because they use a lot of devices, and so it's hard to be able to list every device that you use rapidly in that one moment when you're sitting down for the interview. So what I've started to do is I've asked people ahead of time if I can access their data and see which devices have been active in the last 30 days. So one example of this was a participant named George, where George had actually described how he listened quite a lot on his phone and his smart speaker in different environments. But what was funny was that I had pulled data on George, and I saw that he listened on his computer almost every day. So I asked him, "Hey George, what about listening on your computer? Have you ever tried it?" And he said, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe it. Absolutely. I listen on my computer almost every day. I listen while working. It's a really big part of my working experience." And that's critical information for us to know, because it's really important for us to understand how Spotify plays a role in every part of their life and in every moment. So if we hadn't pulled that data on George, and we hadn't known that he had used his computer, we might have gone the whole interview without him even realizing it or describing that to us, and we would have missed out. So memory is a really tricky thing. For every one thing we remember really well, like Nancy remembering how she accidentally played her Guilty Pleasures playlist, there are tons of things we can't remember well, like how George happened to forget, or at least forget in that moment, that he listened on his computer pretty regularly. And both of these situations can cause issues for data quality for us as researchers. I want to double underline this one point though. The thing is that perception really matters, right? It's important for us to understand that Nancy struggled to find that playlist that one time and accidentally played a much more embarrassing one. But it's also important that we get to the root of their experience, how often these things happen, and what that looks like on a day-to-day basis. Understanding both of these elements together is what drives actionable insights. As researchers, I've come to realize that we really often need other inputs, like the data from George's case, to be able to ensure that we have the accuracy of self-reported behaviors in order to enable accurate descriptions from participants, and even jog their recall, like we did with George. So, in summary, if we think about the memory system, there are 3 things that we need to know as researchers. The first is that attention is required for something to enter into memory. And this is important because not all products have full attention for every point in their experience. The second piece is that memory is imperfect, unlike computers. Human memory is stored in a network of cells, which means it's much more dynamic than computer memory. And lastly, there are retrieval barriers. So these are barriers that can prevent or even bias recall, like we saw with George, where he wasn't able to recall in that one moment that he listened a lot on his computer, even though that was a meaningful part of his Spotify experience. So these are the 3 things that we need to know about memory, and we'll keep these in mind as we go through the rest of the talk. To me, what this means, though, is that it calls into question the validity of solely relying on memory within our research. But, thankfully, simultaneous strangulation can help. Simultaneous strangulation is a form of mixed methods, and we'll talk a lot about what that can look like in a case study next. Here, we'll go through a particular example from my work at Spotify, where we'll talk about how simultaneous strangulation works and how it can combat memory limitations. So first, I want to start off by defining what simultaneous strangulation is. It's a type of mixed methods research, but it's a little bit more specific in a few ways. The first is that it uses complementary methods. The second is that it studies the same group of users. And the third is that it studies that same group of people at the same time. So you can think about it as pointing complementary methods at the same group of people at the same time. So we get a vantage point into that research question and that individual's experience from many different angles. And this is really useful because it generates more comprehensive insights than one method alone could. So to talk a little bit about this, I wanted to first introduce you to Spotify's research team, which is called Product Insights. The one thing that's pretty unique about Spotify's Insights team is that it's made up of both data scientists and user researchers on the same team. We collaborate quite closely, and as a result, we kind of share a set of methods. So I'll walk through what those methods look like for us at Spotify. If we think about our methods in terms of quantitative data to qualitative data, we can think about quantitative data as really good at answering what questions, like what is happening at scale. What are the trends in the data? Qualitative research, on the other hand, is looking at a handful of people as opposed to maybe hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions or trillions of data points on the quantitative side. And the qualitative side is really good at answering why questions, like why we observe that trend at scale. So if we think about user interviews in particular, they fall much more to the qualitative side of this diagram, because typically we only speak to a handful of people, and we're really interested to understand the why behind their experience. Another axis we can think about is behavioral versus attitudinal data. So behavioral data is observing the actions that users take with our product. Attitudinal data, on the other hand, is focused on self-reported experiences, perceptions, mental models, even sentiment towards an experience. So again, using user interviews, we see that user interviews drops towards the attitudinal side of this framework, because it's really great at understanding how people experience a product, what they use it for, how they think it works, and even how they feel about that experience. So if we pepper in the rest of our methods in this framework, you can see that we span all four quadrants. Particularly, I wanted to call out that memory limitations particularly come into play with attitudinal data, because that's where we're asking for people to recall their experiences, and it's self-reported data. We're asking people to remember things and explain them to us. Behavioral data is less focused on memory, because oftentimes we're observing the actions that they take without any interpretation or memory challenges to get in the way. I wanted to quickly highlight that data science is a really meaningful part of this framework as well, because they have a lot of methods that sit in the quantitative and behavioral quadrant here, with things like A/B testing, data tracking, and statistical modeling. User researchers fill out the rest of these quadrants here. So I also want to highlight the fact that you can even do simultaneous triangulation within user research methods alone. It's just that at Spotify, we have access to data scientists, so they fill out pretty much every quadrant that we focus on here. The real power in triangulation is about understanding something from multiple perspectives. And that's meaningful because every method has its strengths and weaknesses. But through triangulation, we're able to combat the strengths and weaknesses of each, and therefore strengthen our methods overall. Each method is able to, when paired properly, counteract the strength and weakness of another, and therefore we're able to get multiple perspectives that generate more comprehensive insights together. Let's talk about a case study of simultaneous triangulation and how it helped me to overcome memory limitations in my own work. So you might think that I'm here from Spotify, that I'd be solely focused on music or podcasts, and though that is true, I also study Spotify Free, and part of the Spotify Free experience is ads. Ads are things that listeners hear as audio or video ads between their songs. And so an example of an ad here you can see is for artisan markets, where they're advertising blueberries. There might be a voiceover that explains how this is healthy and fresh organic produce, in addition to the visual image of the blueberries themselves. So in this particular case study, we wanted to test a new feature in Australia. And this feature is called skippable ads. That means that Spotify Free listeners can skip the ads that aren't relevant to them that come between their songs. So our first approach at studying this was through an A/B test and user interviews. So note this was a mixed methods study, but it wasn't quite simultaneous triangulation. And I'll talk to you a little bit about what that means as we go through. So from the A/B test, what this looked like was that some people in Australia got the skippable ads experience, which means they were able to use this new feature. Other people in the same test weren't in that same cell. They weren't able to skip the ads. They had their normal experience that they were used to. So what we learned from this A/B test was that there were different levels of feature usage. There were some folks who were power users. They used this feature quite a lot. There were some people who were kind of middle users. They used the feature a little bit, but maybe not as much as power users. And then lastly, there were people who had tried the feature but didn't really use it all that much. So we saw these different levels of feature usage play out in the A/B test, and we were really curious to understand when and why do listeners skip ads. We thought that people would start skipping ads immediately and skip every single one that wasn't relevant to them. So we wanted to understand why we saw these differences in the behavioral data from the A/B test. So we decided to interview listeners who had these different levels of feature usage. One of the people that we met in this interview was named Ben. Ben was in the middle group of ad skips. He skipped some of his ads, but not all of them. And we really wanted to understand why that was the case for him. When we spoke to him, he said, "I can't skip all of my ads. I have to wait." That was really interesting, so I followed up saying, "Interesting. Which types of ads couldn't you skip?" And he said, Honestly, I can't remember. It was a week ago. And I went, uh-oh. So this was a problem with attention. We learned earlier that attention is required for something to enter into memory. And what we were experiencing here was that though Ben was paying attention to the music and the ads, he wasn't paying attention to the slightest differences of the ads themselves to be able to understand which he was able to skip and which he wasn't. So Ben's memory limitation could have brought our study to a full stop. If he's not able to explain the why behind his behavior, we're not able to understand it for ourselves and then generate actionable insights either. But thankfully, we were able to follow up with Ben. We asked him to send a screenshot of the next ad that he got that he couldn't skip. And thankfully, he sent us in this picture. You can see that there are two ads here. One that he could skip, the one for Artisan Market and the blueberries, and the other one is a video ad that actually isn't skippable. You can see there's no way to skip this ad here. So it was actually really useful to understand this from Ben, is that we had two different experiences for two different types of ad products. This is pretty confusing because Ben and likely folks listening here don't know the difference between all of our different ad products that exist. What Ben needed was a consistent experience, to be able to skip any ad that wasn't relevant to him, regardless of the format that it took. So thinking about this from a research perspective, we thought this study was mixed methods. And it was, but it wasn't enough to get real insights into Ben's experience and be able to overcome the memory limitations that he faced. What we needed to do was simultaneously triangulate our methods. We got lucky because Ben was able to send us that screenshot and we were able to close that loop. But being able to rely on a participant to send you a screenshot after the interview has ended is a bit tenuous, right? We want multiple ways to be able to understand people's experiences, both what they can remember and even what they can't. So we decided to run this study again, and this time we employed simultaneous triangulation. The methods that we used this time were a diary study along with data tracking. So what this means was that we ran a diary study for 3 weeks with 40 Spotify free listeners. And for every single one of those listeners, for every single day of their experience in that study, we asked if we could pull some of their data as well. So we were asking them to submit a diary study entry every day, and we were pulling their data every single day for every single user in that study. So let's take a look at what this looks like in more granularity. So thinking about the diary study in particular, this was in the form of what we called a listening log. A listening log was something that we sent to participants every single day. We asked them to fill it out every time they listened to Spotify, to tell us a little bit more about the music that they listened to, the podcasts that they listened to, the ads that they got, and if they skipped, why or why not. This was really useful because it gave us in-the-moment data. We weren't relying on their memory like we were with Ben, where maybe he was trying to remember a moment that happened weeks ago. In this case, they were actively filling out the survey as they had just listened. At the same time, my data science partner had built a dashboard that was able to track the behavioral data of each participant in our study. And this was really useful because we got insights into how long each person listened for every single day, which ads they got, how many, and whether they skipped them or not. This was again useful in not relying on their memory because it's behavioral data. We're able to just observe the actions that people take on the app. So what was really powerful was that these two methods are perfectly complementary. Each gives insight into what the other one lacks. The dashboard is really good at being able to capture every single interaction that a participant takes on the app in the duration of the study. But it can't explain to us why participants decided to take those actions. The diary study, on the other hand, is really good at explaining why. We can have people explain to us why they skipped particular ads or why they listened. But we can't fully understand their full experience and every interaction that they take, because likely they won't be able to describe it in enough detail or even remember it all to be able to describe it to us, even if they're telling us about it right after it happened. Can you remember every single click that you've taken on an app that you opened even just a few hours ago? So in this diary study, one of the participants that we met was Matt. Matt had this really interesting behavioral data trend on his dashboard that we noticed about halfway through the study. We noticed that he only ever skipped 6 ads. Even if he got more ads in a given day than 6, he only ever skipped 6. This was really interesting to us. So we dug back through his diary study data to try and figure out why it was 6 in particular, and if he ever mentioned it. But as we read through, we saw things like, I was cooking in the kitchen with my wife, I skipped a bunch of ads that weren't relevant to us, and that's pretty much all he said. This is really useful because we now understand why he's skipping ads, right? He says because they weren't relevant to us. But he also said a bunch of ads. He didn't particularly specify 6. So we wanted to understand why 6 in particular, and why was that the max he was doing every day? So we followed up with him to ask why he only specifically skipped 6 ads. And he said, I can only skip 6 songs because I'm on Spotify free. I guess ad skips must follow the same rule. So what was really interesting here was that on Spotify free, listeners are capped at skipping 6 songs per hour. But ad skips are actually unlimited. But Matt had created this mental model that ad skips follow the same rule as song skips, where he believed that ad skips were capped at 6 as well. So this is really interesting to us because from a research perspective, he never actually would have told us that if we weren't able to pointedly ask. And this was a retrieval barrier. He was able to know that he was only skipping 6 ads. He was probably keeping track of that in his mind, right? But he wasn't able to recall it to us or describe it to us until we actually pointedly asked him. And the dashboard was really critical here because it enabled us to probe with specificity in the diary study. Because we could observe what was going on, we could actually ask more specific and pointed questions for each participant to better understand the particular why behind their behavior in the most granular and nuanced way. In combining both of these methods, we were really able to overcome memory limitations because each method yielded insights that the other one wouldn't have yielded on its own. And what this means from a product perspective was actually really interesting. So we got a lot of insights from a lot of different people, including Matt, and we were able to understand a lot of the awareness, usability, or understanding issues that prevented people from fully using this feature of skippable ads. So we were able to build and send targeted PSA messages to listeners to combat these limitations that they had or these misunderstandings that they had about how the feature worked. So for example, for everyone who was confused, like Matt was confused, about an ad skip limit that actually didn't exist, we could send them a message that looked something like this. You have the freedom to skip. There's no limit to the number of ads you can skip on Spotify. Really. And what was really meaningful here was that as a result of these personal and targeted PSA messages, we were able to double feature usage for this test. And we were only really able to understand these details, like what we learned from Matt, because of the depth of the study we were able to get into from the diary study and the dashboard together. So we just wrapped up a case study where we talked about mixed methods research and then particularly simultaneous triangulation and how even in mixed methods research we still faced some memory limitations because we were sequencing our methods. But in simultaneous triangulation, we were able to really reveal deeper insights because if there was a particular dead end from one method, we were able to probe and follow up with the other method. It was a really meaningful way to get deeper insights from the same group of participants. Next, we'll talk about a 3-step process for how you can implement simultaneous triangulation in your own work. So, to summarize the talk so far, we learned a lot about human memory, and the 3 key things for us as researchers to remember is that attention is required for something to enter into memory, but that not every product or every piece of every product will have full attention for every moment that we experience it. The second piece is that memory is imperfect, unlike computers. And this means that as we gain new experiences, we actually change the cells in our brains and the connections that we make over time. And that sometimes some memories are more readily available to us than others because of things like biases. And lastly, we learned about retrieval barriers. These are things that can prevent or even bias recall. And this was something that we saw with Matt, right? Where he wasn't able to tell us specifically about only being able to skip 6 ads until we were actually able to pointedly ask him that question. So, thinking about memory, we know memory can be faulty, and it's important that we understand where it goes right and where it goes wrong, so we can design our studies accordingly. We also realize that perception really matters. It's important for us to understand how people experience and feel about their experience, but it's equally as important for us to get to the root of that experience and how it physically manifests in day-to-day interactions. So, taking a step back, why does simultaneous triangulation matter? We face these challenges all the time, whether we're aware of them or not. So hopefully now, when you go into your next sessions, you'll be aware of all of those moments and catch the times when people actually aren't able to fully recall or remember the experience that they've had with your product. But the good news is that simultaneous triangulation can help us overcome these memory limitations and actually get to the real story. Because simultaneous triangulation yields insights into the things that people can remember and even the parts that they can't. So let's talk about a 3-step process for how you can implement simultaneous triangulation in your own work. The first step is about identifying the memory limitation. Next, we have to pick complementary methods to mix And third is implementing those methods simultaneously. So in the first step, we need to identify the memory limitation that you might face when researching your product. This is really important that it happens from the research plan stage. Being able to foresee what memory issues you might face will help you design the right study from the start, as opposed to realizing that you're facing a memory limitation when you're already sitting down with a participant in an interview. The next step is about mixing methods in different quadrants to counterbalance the strengths and weaknesses of each. So it's particularly important in simultaneous triangulation that you pick complementary methods. And as we spoke about in the what-why framework, there are certain methods that are more susceptible to memory challenges. And for those cases, it's really important that we pair it with a behavioral method, something that captures the actions that people take without us having to rely on their memory. So in our case at Spotify, oftentimes that looks like partnerships with data scientists. So I would encourage you to try and find a data scientist who you might be able to partner with. But I also realize that that's not the case, or it's not possible for every project. And that's totally okay too. There are a lot of other research methods that we have within our user research toolkit that can also be useful to capture behavioral data. An example of this is a usability study. Being able to observe the actions that people take while going through a flow is really meaningful, because you get to capture with your own eyes what people are struggling with or what they might be really having a harder time with. And that way, you might follow up by asking them, hey, how did that go? How easy or difficult was that for you? And their answer is not only something that you just rely on and take as the truth, but it also is something that you can partner with the observational data that you have. So if someone says, oh, that was extremely easy, but it took them a really long time where they tried to find it in multiple places, you can then see just how easy or hard it was for yourself for them to do, in addition to asking them about it and understanding it from their perspective. And the third step is about implementing these methods simultaneously. This is really the trick, and this is what yields comprehensive insights. So mixed methods is a really awesome and powerful tool, but sometimes mixed methods can be a little bit tricky. If you're not doing this research simultaneously, you run into the potential of either hitting memory limitations or discrepancies between what different methods are saying. But simultaneous triangulation can really help, as we saw here with the dashboard and the diary study. Because both those pieces, if you face a dead end, you're able to get a little bit deeper with the other method and leverage both to understand the holistic research question from more perspectives. So when you're planning your next research study, think about where you might be relying on participants' memory or their recall of an experience. And try simultaneous triangulation, because this has been a really powerful tool for me and my team to get deeper insights into what people can remember and even what they can't. Thank you.